Mr. Rodewald, you are here to help us to explain exactly what's going on and what might be the impact of these vaccines that we talk about, illegally traded and probably problematic. What would be the impact of it on people's health?
Well, this is something we're very concerned about with this serious situation. The vaccines that are sold and the vaccines that are managed and distributed need to be held in a certain temperature range or they start to lose potency. And so when this group started to purchase vaccines and sell vaccines, they didn't manage them well. They came out of temperature, and if that happens, the vaccines can lose potency, and therefore they may not be able to protect the children against the disease they're supposed to protect the children against. Now, we had been hearing a lot in the social media and in the mainstream media about potential toxic effects and dangerous vaccines, but that's not the problem at all. It's highly unlikely that these vaccines will be toxic or dangerous. The problem is that they lose potency and they just may not protect the children. Some of those children will have to be revaccinated to make sure that they are protected from vaccine preventable diseases.
Professor Zhang, the question is, at this moment, biggest one is, where have the vaccines gone to, in fact? And even though we know some of those clues, but not necessarily every clue is in the hands of the investigators. And that's probably where the danger is. Would we be able to, as well as the connected international, rather national investigators team, be able to find out?
Well, I think it's we have to wait to see what the authorities will find out. But I think it's safe to say that the impact of this scandal can be remedied by revaccinate the children that should be vaccinated, and I think that those kids should be relatively easy to identify and revaccinate. So I think that would be the most practical and safe way to cover up the loss or impact, negative impact of this illegal vaccine scandal.
What do you think are some of the most crucial stages that this specific investigation team need to go through in order to really find out the fundamental issues, informations, and also make sure the impact on people's health will be the least?
So the interdisciplinary approach, the multi-agency approach of having law enforcement along with public health agencies such as the Chinese FDA working in close contact together is a vitally important step. And the question is I guess, why wasn't this formed earlier, given that the arrests were quite some time ago of the initial ringleaders, and then the information has been slowly coming out to the public. When was that agency, multi-agency group formed is really critical. Important thing, I guess, from a public perspective from here on, the investigation will obviously have many different facets, but it's vital that that transparency and trust from the public and the government is key.
As an expert from WHO, even though you're an international organization not participating in the investigation itself, but you can provide some of the specific aspect for scrutiny about this investigation and also about ways to provide transparency to the public.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I mean, you have to remember this is about vaccines. Vaccines are so important so that parents can keep their children healthy with the vaccines. And so right away there's even an emotional element to this, and so people care so much about it. And so it's very important that all aspects of this investigation are ones that can be seen and understood, but it's more than just finding out who did it. It's really finding out what was in the system that can be remedied so that it doesn't happen again, because people want to be able to have confidence in the vaccines. They have to have confidence that these vaccines are stored and managed and distributed well. And so I think a key aspect will be what remedies are identified. And so WHO is very interested in looking at remedies and helping to implement remedies. But at one point that we know for sure, it'll involve public sector vaccine distribution oversight. So trying to help shore that up and strengthen that up.
But of course, Mr. Rodewald, you understand that China is going through a transitional period at this time. Before, everything was government controlled, state controlled, and also it's a central planned economy. But now things have varied, and with the reform of the medical sector, there seems to be different ways of that things might happen. So at this point, what do you think might be some of the possibilities of reasons with which the investigator team should look into? What do you think might be some of these loopholes as an observer, of course at the very beginning of the investigation, that people need to pay attention to?
Well, there are some international good distribution practices, and these will look at all aspects of how a vaccine should be handled, stored, and distributed, and implementing the good distribution practices would be a big start. But clearly this was a criminal ring, and they were not a licensed distributor, and so you had to ask, some distributors sold to this unlicensed ring, and so we'll really have to wait and see what the investigation shows for what the specific remedies are. But clearly the private sector distribution needs to be addressed. I think the point that was made earlier about the government program, the expanded program on immunization, the vaccines there, we're confident are managed, stored, and handled well. The program is a wonderful, wonderful program, and it does a great job in protecting children. So, there are some possibilities too of trying to include some of the so-called Category 2 vaccines into Category 1 vaccines, where we know that they'll be managed and stored and handled well. But more important than that, the expanded program on immunization is a very equitable program. Children, rich and poor, rural, urban, migrant, local, they all have access to that vaccine, and it makes a big difference, whereas the private market vaccine is only available to those who can afford to pay for them.
Is that possible, what Mr. Rodewald coming from WHO suggested, more availability of vaccines to the general public free of charge, or at least in a much smaller price than the so-called market price? That's one thing. The other thing is, coming from the academic circle, what do you might think could be some of the things that the investigators now working hard around the clock should look into, complementing what Mr. Rodewald just said?
Well, I think in terms of investigation aspect, we have to pay. I guess the investigators need to pay attention to the both private sector as also the regulatory systems that are part of the ring. I think, and also the hospitals that they deliver the vaccines to the people. Those guys are the like a middle person that handle the vaccine. So anyway, I think the other issue is that how to expand the vaccine program. I think now Chinese economy is going up dramatically compared to many years ago, and I think affordability from the government is much higher than we had before. So I think it's feasible to at least take some of the important vaccines and put into the Category 1, so that without money interest, then this issue from those vaccines will disappear rapidly.
Very interesting point over there. Mr. Phelan, we also see even some international philanthropic organizations have been working with China, discussing the possibility of having vaccines from China being available to the international users even. So what do you make of this incident and its potential impact on some of the important discussions we're having now? Meanwhile, how to make sure that we are not seeing this specific one case as if that is the overall situation of Chinese vaccine, so that we have a right understanding, a proper understanding of exactly what the situations are. Ms. Phelan.
So, as has been mentioned, the Chinese government's manufacturing and distribution of Tier 1 compulsory vaccines is actually very, very good. In 2014, the WHO and UNICEF led a joint report into the distribution process and examined that and concluded that after examination that China's distribution and cold chain process for those vaccines was excellent. Since then, we've also seen Chinese vaccines now, a couple of them come into pre-qualification, which means that they're now available to be used by international organizations in countries around the world. And that was a vitally important step, a really wonderful step for the Chinese pharmaceutical industry and the Chinese public health organizations. What the concern is now that private sector and public sector difference is mixed, and that people take their mistrust and concern from this private sector event into public sector produced vaccines. So I think what's going to be vitally important is that from these investigations and completely separate to the criminal justice process, is that the Chinese government examines how it can impart those really strong regulatory mechanisms, that management, that oversight, and that enforcement on a really early level, not at a criminal stage, but enforcement from an early level of these procedures. How can they translate that to the private sector, and how important it is to ensure that despite having regulations and laws on the books, that agencies like the Chinese Food and Drug Administration are empowered financially and technically to actually carry out enforcement of these laws on the private sector.
All right, and before we go, I got 20 seconds for the two guests here in Beijing. Mr. Zhang, what do you think the ultimate solution should be, and how to make sure vaccines can be available in the right way to Chinese citizens and even with international cooperation to the international population?
Well, I think just to expand the current program, mandatory program, is one solution. The other is to fix the regulation loopholes. And I think overall, I think the vaccine program has been doing very well in public side. We just need to deal with the new issues with a new resolution.
All right, Mr. Rodewald.
I agree. I mean, there should be one standard for oversight of the distribution of vaccine. It should all be high quality standard. But on the other hand, it'd be nice to have a few more of those category 2 vaccines get promoted to be category 1, where they can be given to all children.